I thought we'd start out and take a quick look back at the Brexit situation, which we've talked about a number of times. And again, we really haven't had the time to do it justice with all of the other news and issues that we wanted to cover, including the Democrat debate last week, which we tried to cover in pretty good detail. And I think we got most of the important
Why is this still an issue? Why can't that just...
I mean, would you be pulling your hair out? I mean, if you had voted for this, voted to leave the EU 3 years ago,
yes,
and your country is still not out, and it's like Parliament, it's like our Congress essentially. Parliament is like working against you. They don't want to get out. You watch the debates. I mean, it's. I've spent a lot of time watching Parliament over the last couple of months myself because I think it's fascinating to watch the House of Commons in particular, where it gets very raucous, and everybody's sort of trying to talk each other down and yelling at each other. And then you've got this crazy speaker, John Bercow, who, is very heavy-handed with reestablishing his primacy as the Speaker of the House of Commons.
You're talking about Capitol Hill?
Well, look, this place puts Capitol Hill to shame.
Kookier.
I mean, this place puts Capitol Hill to shame. We really got to get on our game if we want to keep up with the House of Commons, because he's. It's kind of become a funny phrase, but he's order. He has to keep saying order, but he says order. And he just kind of keeps repeating it because they're just yelling at each other. So nobody could talk, When the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, gets up to talk, everybody's yelling, oh, be quiet, sit down, whatever. I mean, you can't really hear what they're yelling. You could just hear this cacophony of sound coming from everybody. But
so they were supposed to withdraw October 31st.
That's right. October 31st was the hard deadline. And, they've been negotiating because they originally said that Boris Johnson didn't want to have a Brexit deal, that he wanted to do what's called a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit, where they just kind of are out of the customs union and there is no ongoing deal for how the relationship will work from that point. Because there's a lot of ties that have been built up over the years between Britain and the EU, obviously, because Britain's been part of the EU. So all their laws have been based on the EU, all their border checks, many, many, many things, labor laws, everything has come down from the EU. So there's a lot to be, split apart there. There's quite a bit of connectivity between the two. So, basically a couple of months ago, if you remember when what they call prorogued Parliament or sent Parliament home for like a month and a couple of weeks. And, of course, Parliament was up in arms about that, particularly Speaker Bercow was up in arms about that. And what they wound up doing was taking the government to the Supreme Court. The government is Boris Johnson and his team, the executive, the Prime Minister and his team. And they took him to the Supreme Court on a case saying, you cannot prorogue Parliament in this way. It's not legal. And the High Court in Britain, the Supreme Court, actually ruled in favor of that position of the parliamentarians who did not want to be prorogued. Now, I'm not a British legal scholar, but it seemed to me that everything was reasonably proper with the way that they went about that proroguing. Now, it was a longer period of time that they wanted to send him home for, and the goal there was basically to send him home so they couldn't cause a whole bunch of problems leading up to Brexit, which was supposed to occur, in a couple of days, actually. But that didn't really happen, obviously. The Supreme Court stepped in, ruled that the government had not legally prorogued Parliament and that Parliament should come back into session. Well, then Parliament gets back in session and they start passing different things, different bills and other things, later amendments to a deal. And the first bill they passed was the Benn Act, which was requiring Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, to go back and ask for additional time to get through January 31st of 2020 before the Brexit deadline, because the current deadline is this Thursday. So anyway, Boris Johnson didn't want to do that, and there was all this noise. I mean, it was kind of hard to pick through as to whether he wanted to get a deal or he wanted to do a hard Brexit. Well, at the end of the day, he actually comes back with a deal. Now, there's many different opinions on whether this deal is a good deal or a bad deal or what the status of the deal is. But, hey, it was a deal. So I think he kind of disproved his critics there who said that he didn't want a deal because he brought back a deal. Some way, somehow, in a couple of weeks, they were able to negotiate a full deal for the split from the European Union. But then Parliament added on some additional amendments, the Letwin Amendment to that deal that essentially killed the ability to go forward with the deal at this time. So, Parliament has just done everything it can, just to summarize, to frustrate the ability of Britain to exit from the EU. And I think it's a little bit sad because at the same time Parliament is talking about, we're a democracy and we Parliament are in charge of this democracy. Well, wait a minute. The democracy voted. The people voted, right? They voted to get out of the EU. And Parliament's doing everything it can to frustrate that. So now the latest development, because what we didn't know would happen or not, would be whether the EU would play along, whether they would grant an extension through January 31st of 2020 for this Brexit continued negotiations, or whether they would say, no, you're out October 31st, whether we have a deal or don't have a deal. Well, now the EU's come back and they've granted the extension. So now this goes on. And I think in the interim, what's going to happen in the UK, for those who are interested, I think what's going to happen is Boris Johnson is pushing for a general election nationally. So they want to elect a whole new government nationally, and this will come into play because it's a parliamentary system, so it's not like our system where there's basically two parties. Now, there's no rule that says that there's only two parties, but the two parties have pretty well got themselves ensconced, and it's not possible to get access to ballots or debates, media, other things. So the two parties are pretty well ensconced in America, but over in Britain, they've got all different kind of parties, and so it becomes this sort of patchwork that'll form a government. Several different parties will get together, and it's the same thing that's going on over in Israel right now. Where Benjamin Netanyahu's trying to form a government by making coalitions with other parties. And, of course, Netanyahu hasn't had success in doing that. That's some news out of Israel. But there's going to be possibly – now, what's really interesting is the other parties, Labour Party, is against having an election, and they're not currently in power. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. If they think they're right and they think the people are on their side – wouldn't they want to have an election so they can get more seats and they can come into power, and then they would have a Labor, prime minister? That would make sense, right? But they're fighting the idea of even having an election because they really don't want to put this back to the people, because the British people, I think, by and large, do want to leave the EU.
They're in favor of Brexit.
They're in favor of Brexit. And Nigel Farage has got his Brexit party out there. And they could win a whole bunch of seats in the upcoming general election. Now, this hasn't been called for. And again, I do expect you'll see some of the other parties try to frustrate this process. But, my sort of take on everything is just thinking how frustrating it would be to have voted to leave the EU 3 years ago and to still have your government fighting that the whole way, even though the people voted. Why even have the referendum? They're not going to do what the people want. The only thing they're allowed to do is stay in the EU. Now, if they'd voted that way, they would be trumpeting how they won, and everybody wants to stay. But if they lose, they refuse to do what the people voted for. That's just hypocrisy, and it's very frustrating. I'm sure the British people are very frustrated. We'll be right back. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.